Okay, well, I think we are going to get started. My name is Karen O'Brien. I'm the Executive Director of the Michigan Recycling Coalition, and welcome to our very different annual conference this year. We are really close to the end of this 4-week escapade. As you know, we're having to do things a little bit differently this year. Our key word, I think, is adaptive. And this is our last week of programming. This is one of our keynotes. We also have a keynote speaker tomorrow. Before we get started, I'd really like to share with you that we've already hosted 10 conference sessions. Those are 90-minute sessions. There are recordings of all of them. Really good content, very in-depth with good speakers. So we hope that you go to our conference page and catch up on some of the sessions you may have missed, maybe help colleagues find sessions that might be interesting and helpful to them as they go forward. We do have another keynote presentation tomorrow that is with Nina Butler from Stina, formerly of More Recycling, and Ralph Shammy from the International Monetary Fund. They're going to talk about the paradox of plastic, and it definitely is a paradox. I really want to give a shout out to our sponsors this year. These sponsors have been with us over the past several years, very loyal following of sponsors who support our work. And we couldn't be more appreciative. We've been able to accomplish a lot, and it is because of the support of these sponsors. So we hope that you'll thank them with your business. A little housekeeping for you. Please keep yourself on mute. Submit questions through chat as we go forward. The webinar is being recorded. If you have any technical issues or any specific questions, you can have a direct chat with Help Desk Terry. You can look for her. She will find a way to help you. And Kelly will be highlighting the speaker, so that you're likely to see just me and the presentation, but you ultimately get to control your own view. Up in the right-hand part of your Zoom screen, you'll see an icon that looks something like this, so you can change that view. You can also use this slide toggle between the people and the presentation to enlarge or make that small, depending on what you would like to see. Without further ado, I will introduce Deborah Dull. Our session today is really Circularity isn't charity, it is operational strategy. This is really all about the supply chain and how we consider kind of circularity in the supply chain. Deborah Dull is the founder of the Circular Supply Chain Network and a principal of manufacturing product management for GE Digital, where she is responsible for supply chain circular economy and customer success. So without further ado, Deborah Dull.
Thank you very much, Karen, and thank you everybody for coming to share this time with me today. I am really excited to share some of the thoughts I've got around circularity, what it means for supply chain, what it means for our operations, and how I suspect the world will shift in the coming years. We're going to spend about an hour together today, and it's going to be a little bit of a different session. I'm going to ask you to take your phones out, not like they're far away from you probably, and we are going to have some participative questions. So how this is going to work is we're going to get our phones out, or you can open a browser, although it's better experience on mobile. And you are going to open a new browser and go to menti.com. Menti.com is a survey tool, and it's a fun way to interact together. And once you go to menti.com, you can enter the code you see in the top of the screen, 28043306. And if you do that properly, you will have the chance to have a little toggle across your screen across these 4 terms. Somebody has figured it out. How much have you heard about the linear economy, planned obsolescence, the circular economy, and what's called the butterfly diagram? Either nope, I've never heard of it before, or I could teach this right now if you gave me the chance to. So let me know where you are. And of course, this helps me to spend more or less time on a certain topic, depending on where you all are. Oops, sorry about that. And we've got decent understanding of the linear economy, which is great. Good understanding of the circular economy, which is fantastic. Some mixed bag on plant obsolescence and a low score on the butterfly diagram. I'm going to give this another 10 seconds or so you can join. Again, if you're just joining us, we're going to menti.com, best experience on your phone, and enter the code you see at the top of the screen. We're going to use this throughout the presentation, so leave this out and close by so you're able to participate in feedback. Pretty nice spread. So this is interesting. You will know all of these items when you leave here today. Let's go to the next question here. This is a bit of a pop quiz. How much material in tons enters the global economy each year? Is it 50 billion, 70 billion, or 100 billion? Try not to Google it. Just give it a wild guess and see. And again, we'll give this about 10 more seconds if you're just joining us, menti.com. This is a participative discussion today. Give this 2-3 more seconds and I will do a reveal. 100 billion tons is the right answer. So if that's what you picked, congratulations. The world is 8.5% circular today. That leaves over 90 billion tons of materials every single year up for grabs, and we'll talk about that. Last question before we get started. Does your organization have a target around sustainability, ESG, circularity, carbon, decarbonization, some sort of a goal around the planet of some kind? And either you do, you don't, you're actually maybe not sure if your company does. So far, more do than don't. Give this a couple of moments and you can reflect and wonder, gosh, does my organization have a target of some kind around sustainability, decarbonization, perhaps even circularity? More and more now do, which is really interesting and fun to see how that's progressing. Okay, perfect. So again, keep your phones out. I will come back and ask you a couple of questions as we spend time together today. So we're going to explore these two concepts, waste and value. I spend a lot of time thinking about these. I spend even more time thinking about how circularity and the supply chain fit together, and we'll get into that. But for now, imagine in supply chain, of course, we have value and waste, and we spend all of our time looking for ways to increase value and decrease waste. I first learned about process improvement and the elements of lean during university when I studied supply chain, but I think it was actually elements of my childhood that helped me learn that there can be value in waste. I grew up in a fairly rural area, central Washington state, the apple capital of the world, or at least of the US. And both my parents grew up on farms. And we had a couple of small areas on our property where we could grow food and we composted. So from an early age, I learned which food scraps could be composted, which couldn't, and that compost went on to garden, the garden grew the food, we ate the food, and so forth. So this became my first lesson in circularity. My father was a woodworker and he built houses and furniture and boats out of wood. When I was small, I sometimes got the little scraps of wood to play with, but more often than not, he found ways to reuse those scraps as he built something new. So again, another lesson in circularity. So again, in this time we have together today, let's explore value and waste. Up until this point, as a global economy, as many of you know, we have seen value sort of like this: customer, supplier, customer, supplier, customer, supplier, and so forth. It happens in a line. And along that line, we find and eliminate waste. Now, the circular economy says there are more opportunities to make money than what we're doing today. It doesn't have to be a line. It can be circular, or in my artistic rendering here, loopy. The circular economy says there's more value to be had, where today we have waste, tomorrow we have value. Many of you already are familiar with this, of course. So what does a circular economy mean for businesses? We'll cover three topics, three areas today. One, of course, background on the circular economy in case you're not familiar. Maybe you will learn something new even if you are familiar. Two, what does this mean for supply chains? What's a circular supply chain? And third, getting started. We believe there are 7 phases to help transition you from linear to circular operations. So before we get going and all of these, let's think about where did the concept of circularity come from? And certainly the elements and the basics of the circular economy started well before this time, but let's take a quick adventure. Imagine this is 15 years ago on Christmas Eve, just off the coast of Australia. There is a solo sailor working her way around the world. And here on this Christmas Eve, she is doing inventory of the supplies on her boat. Inventory is my most favorite topic in the world. So of course, this story caught my interest. And she had this aha moment that just as she would run out of supplies, ideally just after she gets home, she realized actually the planet is going to run out of supplies as well. And as the supplies on her boat is fueling her trip, the supplies on the planet, of course, fuel our global economy. So she returned home and she started learning about different concepts. She discovered the Cradle to Cradle Institute. She discovered, yes, we are in fact running out of materials. And she learned about another Christmas Eve about 100 years before that. So let's time travel now back to 1924. This is Geneva. Somewhere in one of those side streets you see, there was a secret business meeting among a few business owners who all made the same item. And they all had the same problem. Their item that they made was selling, but not quite quickly enough to keep them in business. So they really all had the same problem of how are we going to stay in business with this item that we are making together. Have a mental guess in your mind. Here we are in Switzerland. What do you think the item was? It was actually the light bulb. So at this point in time, light bulbs lasted 2,500 hours. Lighting was becoming popular, but not popular enough. And so a decision was made among these business owners to cap the life from 2,500 hours to 1,500 hours. And this is really important because this is the first known meeting of planned obsolescence that we know about. And planned obsolescence, of course, is the idea that we build trash into the economy, essentially. At what point will it stop adding value and it becomes waste? Historically speaking, this was a very interesting time in history. It comes just 2 years after Henry Ford coined the term mass production. And of course, this is the beginning of the second industrial revolution. And since then, we've gotten really, really good at making items. And as many of you know, of course, it's called the linear economy. We take something out of the planet, we make it rather efficiently, and then it's no longer adding value to us and we consider it waste. And from all of this mass production, something pretty outstanding has happened. I call it mass ownership. It's pretty cool. This type of economy has really allowed the middle class to grow. I believe some of this planned obsolescence, particularly in the 70s in the US, has helped to spur women's liberation, get women out of the kitchen. So it's not all bad. You know, there's some really positives that have come out of the last year. But we're at a bit of a tipping point. The items that we have in our lives aren't all used. So while we can all start to become, you know, this idea of mass ownership, we can all own more items, the items aren't being used. And the circular economy says if something's not being used, it's not adding economic value. And so can we shift away from ownership to use models? And with cars, of course, we talk about Uber. So instead of selling a car to one person and have it sit the majority of its time parked, now we have the same car and many 20, 30, 40, 50 people use it in a day. And every time they use it, there's a dollar exchange. That dollar exchange goes into the economy. And of course, the whole premise of the circular economy says that's how we grow our economy. So let's take an example from my day job. By day, I build industrial software at GE. And our friends over in GE Aviation a few years ago realized that airlines actually don't want to buy and maintain engines. It's not their core competency. What they really want to do is to be in the air. They want a concept called time on wing. So they only pay us when that engine is functioning in the air. And this is really important and part of a key concept of the circular economy, because assets and machines are smart now. We can combine 600 sensors we put on each engine together with data science and a ton of math. And we know more now than we ever have before. We know what happens with humidity and altitude and pressure and smog and the impact that all of that has on the life of this engines. And because we produce 80% of the world's airplane engines. We've got lots of other engines to compare this one to, and we can get really, really smart about what it takes to have this engine last forever. This becomes a core element of the circular economy, which we'll talk about in a few slides. This is the idea of a smart machine. Let's think about the idea of a smart process. And let's head now to the 1970s in Denmark. Now, the problem facing a few factories here was, how do we find a continuous supply of fresh, affordable water? In this picture, you can see a lot of water, but it's actually salt water. So a few of the factories had an idea: what if they co-located and started to share water? That idea has persisted and expanded beyond water, and it looks like this. It's called the Kallenberg symbiosis. It still functions today. And as you can see, they exchange heat, they exchange water, and they exchange materials, byproducts that come off of one line that can be used in another line. Collectively, these companies save $100 million a year. Now, that might not seem like a lot for some of these companies, but it's still $100 million. So for one co-located site, we start to see some real savings from resource exchanges. And if there's one thing we know from this last year, it's resource security is really important for our operations to continue to run. I think our supply chains are more fragile than we were willing to admit, but this last year has taught us quite a bit. So if we take this concept that's on the screen and we stretch it to be regional, now we start to see the basis of a circular economy. So two types of resources that circulate in a circular economy. On the green side, we have renewables. This is like composting when I was a kid. This is anything that could add value back into the biosphere: water, air, food scraps, etc. On the blue side, these are items that would not go back into the biosphere. We call them technical. These are plastics or metals. And you can have big loops and small loops, continual loops, and they look like this. This is called the butterfly diagram. You may have actually seen this and not known that it was called the butterfly diagram. And you can see these different sizes of loops. So again, on the green side, I can't do left and right because I never can figure it out. And it's still somehow challenging for me to say green and blue. On the green side here, we have the items that go back into the biosphere. And again, the idea is we have these small loops, and you want to keep the loop as small as possible for as long as possible as we go through. So the green side is regenerative, the blue side is technical. Let's look at the technical side because it's a little bit easier to get our head around. So the idea is the user, and ideally the user uses that item as much as possible, 24 hours a day. If they can't, the next best idea is to share. So we start to see sharing economies. Consumer-wise, we're starting to see the idea of tool libraries. So for example, the life of an electric screwdriver, it's usually used for 15 minutes total in its lifespan. So instead of having it sit in the hall closet, we could instead have it be in a tool library, checked out, and used many, many, many 15 minutes by many, many people around the city. And of course, the whole point here is, do we spend all of that metal and plastic into and electronics into one electric screwdriver that's sold to 1,000 people, or do we build one, only put that burden on the planet, and we charge 1,000 people some amount of money for that screwdriver, and it actually adds more value into the economy and it takes less waste. So this is the premise of the sharing economy. Then you see we'll reuse, we'll redistribute, we'll refurbish, we'll remanufacture, and yes, there is recycling, but as all of you well know, recycling is super resource intensive. And so I suspect the land of recycling and the industry of recycling will expand to take on additional value adds to the economy, where today we sort of sprint towards the point of sale and everything else that happens is an afterthought. The circular economy says actually the point of sale is the beginning of our story, and everything that happens after sale is now the hero of our story of our economy. So all of you will become tomorrow's superheroes, I predict, as we go through the circular economy. So 3 principles. It's important to do these in order. The circular economy says that organizations that anchor in these principles will, of course, reduce waste and become more profitable. So the first principle is to design waste out. First, we've got to see if we can get rid of whatever process it is that's taking resources or creating emissions. Do we really need it to begin with? Then we circulate those materials forever. And if we do all this properly, we can regenerate natural systems, which, as I'll show you at the very end, is really important because we need natural systems to continue to produce resources for us to use to fuel the economy. So that last one really becomes the key to how we can continue to move forward as an economy. Last concept here that's really important and I think really exciting. It's this idea of decoupling. Right now, as we grow, we have our costs and our needs that grow alongside with us in a variable cost type of a way. And the circular economy gives us in operations a way to separate that out. How this works is we look at how the linear economy has been running. This is a graph from the World Economic Forum. What it essentially says is for about 100 years, the cost of commodities have come down. There's a few blips for world wars there, but in general, we come down because technology is getting better and we are improving our ability to use concepts like lean management. However, in the last 20 years, as you can see, the pull of demand on the resources in the planet has taken such an uptick that we've essentially undone all of our hard work of the 1900s and our prices are back to pre-1900 type of pricing holding for inflation. Now, what the circular economy says is, can we replace virgin inputs, first time use primary inputs with secondary inputs and help us to decouple this growth? So if we didn't need to have the same level of never used before material, virgin material, enter our value streams, then we could actually decouple, which also reduces our cost. So this idea of decoupling is really important. It's the basis of the ability to grow our businesses, grow our economies with less virgin material. So get your phones out. I'm going to ask you just one question here. And if you're just joining us, this is a participative discussion. Please go to menti.com and enter the code that you see above. Now, my question for you is, which type of material has disrupted you in this last year? You will have an option to pick regenerative. That's that green side, water, heat, discussions about renewable energy, for example. Has the availability of power disrupted your operations, maybe during some snowstorms? The other side, technical, this is availability of metals or plastics or other finished good type of materials that go into your operations. Or were you lucky enough to be disrupted by both? So think back in this past year and think, gosh, my operations really have been impacted some way or another. And we start thinking about these two sides of the butterfly diagram. In reality, every operation uses both types of resources, but we often look at them in these two different ways. So a lot of folks had both. Many folks had a technical resource disruption. Thank you for your answer. We'll come back to this in a couple more slides. So we've looked at what is the circular economy. Many of you are familiar with this topic coming in, so hopefully you learned something new in there. The next item we're going to cover is what is a circular supply chain. I'm going to introduce you to a definition that we use, walk you through that very quickly, and then look at 5 characteristics of a circular supply chain so we can get our heads around it. So circular supply chains are interconnected systems. Now we know that supply chains, some people call them value networks, and we know that it is already a network. However, in reality, many of our supply chains are still disconnected from each other and from themselves. There's a lot of work to fully digitize supply chains, and then we're not fully interconnected. So when we think about this idea of interconnected systems, it really starts to pull on the concept of ecosystems as we start to learn how nature's been running and what parts of nature can we pull in, like the idea of industrial symbiosis, those the co-located factories. That's definitely taking a page from nature. So they're interconnected systems. These secondary and regenerative inputs, this shouldn't be a surprise to you by now. So everything coming in to the operation comes from someplace else. It's already been used before, or it's from a regenerative source, meaning or a renewable source, right? So it's solar or wind power, for example, as inputs in. They generate value. No waste is generated from a circular supply chain. It's only called waste because we haven't found a customer for it yet. Industrial waste in America is a $57 billion a year industry, a number many of you are probably already familiar with. And we do this by reducing and extending resource use. How do we stretch the life of the assets in our supply chains? How do we apply lean thinking, use less, maybe shorten our supply chain operations so we're not driving items around the world? Let's go through 5 characteristics and we can start to get our heads around circular supply chains. So first, a circular supply chain is lean. Again, this should feel very familiar to us. Where many organizations are focusing now is less energy and water. This is a really nice place to start because it's becoming more and more measurable as we apply sensors across our operations. It saves us a lot of money. It tells a really nice story about less emissions and less pull on the environment. If lean is about finding and eliminating waste, then circularity is about finding and monetizing waste. So this starts to become the link and the shift. I think circularity is an extension of lean. Next, a circular supply chain is visible. So after we lean out our process, and again, we think the waste from one process becomes the inputs for another process. That means every process in the world right now is producing new types of raw materials for new types of customers. A couple of years ago, we used to talk about how data is the new oil. I actually think that's not true. I think data is the table stakes for participating in a new type of global economy. And again, if everyone is now the source of raw materials, everyone now has new types of customers. So if you think about your primary value stream of whatever it is your process is outputting today, and that continues, and then every source of waste that happens during your operation, what if you had a buyer for every single source of waste? First, of course, we try to eliminate it, but we've been trying to do that for a long time. So this starts to give us an opportunity to have another lever. The circular economy says there's more customers out there, and with more customers comes more value, and we can have additional value streams. So in order to do this, a circular supply chain needs to be predictive. So if we think about these new types of customers who are participating with us as perhaps a secondary customer, we start to need to give them more information about these inputs than we did before. So similarly, if you're starting to buy somebody else's processed waste, you need to be giving a different type of demand signal to a different type of supplier. Very similarly, we need to give a different type of supply plan, supply availability to others who want to participate in a resource exchange or circulation with us. So this idea of predictive is a little bit of an expansion of what we do today. A lot of what we look at is how do we anticipate end consumer demand. And I think we'll have more focus in this process pieces upstream to start to better predict waste production. And nobody likes to talk about their waste right now, so this is a tough place for us to start getting a baseline to start predicting. But we'll share it eventually because there's money to be made. The fourth one here is a circular supply chain is regional. And again, if our first principle of the circular economy is to use less, and global logistics makes up 15% of worldwide emissions, we probably need to start thinking about challenging ourselves on how far we're shipping different items around the world. We all remember a few weeks ago, the Suez Canal, very much showing us that we are shipping a tremendous amount still all over the world, and it's getting pretty wide. Anything you're wearing right now has covered thousands and thousands of miles before it ever got to you. Your iPhone went around the moon and back before you ever turned it on. And so we have these very, very long supply chains. But the whole concept of the circular economy, of course, is that we can harvest, transform, and use materials regionally. This is a picture of Cape Town, South Africa, and they are really leaning into this idea of industrial symbiosis, that co-location of factories to share resources. The last one here is a circular supply chain is flexible. So if we think about the range of materials that may start to be used in our supply chains, we need to start to be ready in our operations. So what this might look like is there's a company called Zymergen. I'll talk about them a little bit more later. They just went public actually, and their research shows that more than half of the materials used in our global economy, more than half of that 100 billion tons a year, could actually come from biology instead of coming from inside the planet, which is kind of a cool concept. Last time I took biology, I was 15, so I don't know a lot of the details on this, but the idea that we could start producing materials in a different way is very interesting. What this also starts to introduce is the idea of characteristics of the materials that we need, rather than the absolute specifications that we use today. So this starts to create a tolerance range where we might describe the viscosity of a material instead of exactly what it is we need. This allows unlikely substitutions, maybe that we haven't used before, which allows us to make good choices and have different types of materials through our operations. All right, so here are the 5 characteristics of circular supply chains. They are lean, visible, predictive, regional, and flexible. Take your phones out. I'm going to ask you 2 questions here. The first one is, which one is most interesting to you? It doesn't have to be necessarily in your day-to-day, but just from an interest level, which one sparked the, oh, that's kind of interesting type of interest? And if you're just joining us, you can open menti.com on your phone. Just go to menti.com, enter the code you see at the top of the screen, and you should find this question in front of you. Nice spread so far, a little bit of a tie happening. Flexibility is pulling ahead. Nope, here's regional and predictive, also catching people's interest, which is quite cool. Thank you for answering that in a very, oh, we've got a couple more coming in. A very similar question on the next one, but it's going to be one of the slidey bars. Now I'm going to ask you about your team. How much could each of these benefit your team? So either, look, it's not even possible for us to contemplate tackling this idea right now, or it could be pretty transformational. If I had a magic wand, if it would work, this would be a pretty big deal for us. So again, you're going to have the option to slide your thumb across or your finger across the screen and pull across. How much could each one benefit your team? Regional benefits being huge for the first person who answered, and a nice spread of how much each of these could help. It's kind of fun to see the little hills growing behind our averages here. This is always an interesting one because I think any type of supply chain, of course, we build doesn't work perfectly for all models, but our challenge as we set up operations and sort of the backbone of society is we need to be able to sort out how to make a system that can work for the most types of operations and most types of businesses as possible. So circular supply chains, as we can see, not quite the same benefits across, although somewhat consistent, but hopefully there's some benefits in there for each of our operations. Really excited to see regional come across. There's some very interesting discussions happening here. I'll actually be speaking at GreenBiz's Circularity 21 in about a month about reshoring of manufacturing in America. Should be a very interesting discussion. My interest, of course, is because circular supply chains are short, and the shorter supply chain we can make, the better. All right, perfect. Let's go back and do our final section we have together today. So we've been exploring these concepts of value in waste. And now, of course, the question I always get is, this is all well and good, Deborah, but how in the world am I actually supposed to do something useful and practical with this? So I will walk you through a few ways to get started in your own operations. And to do this, we'll remember all of these different loops, the big loops and small loops on this butterfly diagram, and start imagining these as I'm going to introduce a couple new terms to you, but keep these loops in mind. So we've got these 7 ways, 7 phases of shifting from a linear to a circular operation. The language here is the language from the circularity community, not necessarily from the operations community, but I have a decoder key at the very end you can take a snippet of if it's useful to you. So let's walk through these 7. The first one is called identify. This one, of course, this is an easy place to start, or a predictable place to start, of where exactly is this waste I can turn into value and add more value into my operation and make more money. This is Bill McDonough. He founded the Cradle to Cradle Institute. And I like this idea of fugitive value. It's escaped from a value chain. Everything has value in a circular economy. The idea is, any material we have that exists, somebody will find it useful. The magic here is, how do we get it back into a home? How do we recapture it into a value stream or a value chain to some extent? So we need to start looking at our operations in ways that maybe traditionally we haven't. So for example, imagine if you've participated in a value stream mapping activity or some sort of a process walk, and we might go somewhere that looks like a receiving dock, and we might see something that looks like this. Now, a couple of ways that we can look at this that's not perhaps as common. Now, of course, we can go to the back corner and we always find a pile of dead inventory, and we know that there's something that needs to happen with that. But there is something common across all of these, which is supplier packaging. And because we don't directly pay for it, we indirectly pay for it, we often don't capture these types of supplier packaging examples, or the pallets that we see. These don't count sometimes as we look at the materials going through our own value chains. And so we need to take a different look at our standard processes, the ones we've been running for years. And in those looks, we might find a few areas where we could actually start to add additional value or make money. If you have some level of digitization in your operation, in your process, in your supply chain, this is a great time to leverage it. Because our supply chains are so big and so complex, often technology can be a great helper as we're trying to find where exactly are these value leaks. The goal here is for us to identify everything coming into a process and everything going out of a process. So pick one. It might be a single facility, it might be a single line on that facility, but look at everything that's coming in and try to understand where it's coming from, if possible. Then look at where it's going out. How much of that is your finished good, your value stream as it is today, and how many are waste streams? And then we can try to measure. The whole point of this step is only just to become aware and to measure this idea of an in-out ratio. In the chemical industry, they use something called mass balance. It's almost like this idea of balancing out what came in and what goes out. The only goal here, again, is to just become aware and measure. This target of 100% just means, is it a 1-to-1 ratio? Do you know where everything that goes in goes out to? After we do that, we can actually start to take some actions. It's harder than it seems like it should be, but not impossible. Then we go on to the step called intensify. The goal here is around utilization. So intensifying the use of any given item through our operations. We can do this in 3 ways. The first way is to redesign our business model, maybe something like product as a service, which we've covered. The second might be to redesign a product or the assets we use in our operation. They might become modular. So instead of having an operation pause because some piece of equipment has gone down, we can swap out that area, just that one module that's causing issues, and the operation can continue. Or the third way is we can actually redesign our processes. And of course, this is the space that we own. And the idea here, of course, is we want to design waste out of the system. In the future, we may see more about decentralization. Right now, we've got big centralized processing facilities, which has made a lot of sense for a long time. As we start imagining the future state, however, it may be that smaller operations located closer to the point of use make sense. And I've got a slide in that somewhere here in the following slides. So this is measured through utilization. The goal in our operations is that everything we have in our operation is utilized all the time. That's the goal. Is it possible to have a piece of machinery bolted to the ground, shared across operations? Not frequently, but this is where we can start imagining facility sharing, or somehow getting creative to keep that piece of equipment running. If 2 organizations can utilize similar types of lines, that of course means that we don't have to build 2, we can use the same one. Very complicated to do this, but it is technically possible. Then we get into the land of narrow. This is about using less. As I mentioned before, many of the organizations I speak with are still very focused on water and electric. And again, this is a great place to start because it has so many different values for us. We can save money, we can reduce our emissions. So it's a good story all around. Now, I had just mentioned decentralizing operations. One way that we can use less is to cut out a lot of logistics processes that we have right now. One way that Unilever is doing this is a new concept they're calling nano manufacturing. This is launched. You can go and find it on the internet. They have put an entire food production line in this 40-foot container, and they can go and plop it in a local market wherever the need is. So they can go put it close to point of use, produce what's needed, and then actually move it to a new market, produce what's needed there. Not to be outdone, Microsoft has put an entire server in a server farm data center in a 40-foot container. They're also looking at completely offline. So just plop this down, it produces its own energy and it can run anywhere, which is kind of a cool concept as well. So the idea here, of course, is we want to reduce waste. We want to have 100% waste reduction. A couple ways we can do this. We can, of course, eliminate large areas of the process. Like we've talked about, we can reduce what's used during that process. Or we can also sell the waste, which then means it's no longer a waste, it's actually a value producer. And it's a good way to say we don't produce waste because we're selling it to someone else. Then we get into predict. Now we've talked about predict. We're in the middle of Industry 4.0, of course, and the sophistication of technology is quite high. The cost of sensors are quite low. Some of our processes lend themselves better to digitization and becoming smart processes, but most processes have places we can start to leverage technology in a smart way in order to apply all the principles we've just talked through. Now, this one is about predict, which again gets towards if I'm going to have new types of customers who are going to buy new items from me, previously called waste, I need to be able to tell them something about my ability to produce those for them. And if we want to be able to find and circulate materials or facilitate something like a take back program, we need to know a lot about those materials and those products. So today we have some visibility. We've talked about the potential to have flexible operations. One interesting company to go check out is called the Excess Materials Exchange. And they have this idea of a kind of a dating service for materials to pair them. They are exploring the concept of the periodic table of uses instead of the periodic table of elements. And that gets back to the conversation we just had around how flexible can we be in our operations. Quite a cool concept. The way we measure this is I'm saying forecast accuracy, but you see I've got little quotes there. It's not forecasting like we've previously done. This is forecasting waste and forecasting resource availability in our operations, which, as we've talked about, people don't really like to do today. So it's a little bit of a different flavor. Then we get into slow. This is about extending the life of any given asset in our process, ideally so that it lasts forever. We have talked about the airplane example from my day job, but we could also talk about the internet and the servers behind the internet. The internet is, of course, a real physical place. And if you have been working at home part of this last year, the internet is the reason you're able to do that. Now, the choices we make, whether we have heavy or light analytics, whether we have heavy or light storage or file sharing, whether we email huge attachments to each other or leave them on an optimized file share and only email a link. All of this has repercussions. If we end up with 5, 10, 20, 40 versions of the same document, guess what? That's more server space. And so the choices we make in our digital operations actually make a huge impact on how much materials needed from the planet to build these servers, to maintain these servers, all the coolants, everything that goes into running these centers. But of course, it may be something more simple like the vehicles that we have running through operations, or it might be that one really important piece of equipment that without it, our operation stops. So of course, the land of MRO isn't new to us. We've been repairing our assets for a really long time. I predict something kind of cool is going to happen. I'm going to call it in-network and out-of-network spare parts. So we have these whole supply chains behind these spare parts right now. Sometimes it can be really hard to get a hold of spares. Some of the spare parts in my world in heavy industry take 1.5 years to build. just the spare part. And so when we think about spares, this becomes, again, a much higher focus for us in the coming years. We measure this through version improvement. What that means is if the item lasted 5 years in its last life, its next life, it should last 100% longer. It should last 10 years. The next version should last 20 years and so forth, with the premise that everything should be able to last forever if maintained correctly. Then we get to close. Now, this is probably the concept we talk about the most with the circular economy, is how do we have everything coming from a secondary or renewable source. An example I'll give here is from the company BASF. They have this concept called Verbund, very similar to the Kallenberg symbiosis, that shared industrial symbiosis idea we talked about from Denmark from the 70s, but it's still running today. BASF has 6 of these types of sites all around the world, and they're able to share their own resources with each other. So they've taken this idea and, as you can see, spread it across 4 different places. This is the example of Zymergen. So I talked about them earlier in the discussion. They just went public, and they have this idea of bio-based functionality and bio-based designs. Quite cool, worth looking at. And again, the estimation is that 60% of the materials entering our economy could be made with biology, which is just a tremendous shift in the way that we look at and the relationship we have with materials, which is really the key point of the circular economy. So then we get to closing the loop. This means to measuring closing the loop around everything comes in as secondary sourced. The last one we have is capture. So this is the idea that, look, we have some waste out in the world that just isn't valuable to us in its current form. So I predict we'll have something called secondary materials as a service. One newer company innovating in this space is called Transact Energy, US based. They can take mixed waste and produce, without emissions, like virgin commodities out the other side that can be sold on the global commodities market. So the technology for materials is coming along, but we also have done scrap metal recovery for a long, long time, and this will continue to be at the heart of the idea of circular operations. So we measure this one through capacity. Now, where all the other ones were 0 coming up to 100, this one is something way more than 100. We want to bring down to just 100. Right now, we go and mine the planet and push all that into the economy and then go find uses for it. What the circular economy says is actually we don't want to pull in more materials than what's needed. So we only want to bring in those items to get us at capacity. So here's our decoder key. Like I mentioned, we've got the first column on the more circularity language, the second column on language we're probably more familiar with around waste, utilization, Kaizen, and so forth, the measurements I had just mentioned, and the goal for each. As we start looking at these ideas like capture, we can look at post-consumer materials or post-industrial use. And those, again, those concepts are not new for us. We see those as we look around us. I've got 2 final questions for you and a small section after. So if you're just joining us, pull out your phones. And we are going to go through these 7 concepts we just went to. You can, again, pull along. So the question is, how far along is your part of the supply chain or your operation in your ability to do these items? So if you're just joining us, please go to menti.com, enter the code at the top of the screen, and you should be presented with this option. Now, again, identify is, do we even know where items are coming from and to in our processes? Intensify is, can we use the items in our processes fully? Narrow is, how do we use less? Predict is, do I know when and how I'll be producing waste? Slow is about extending the life of an item as long as possible. So you have a maintenance plan in place, for example. Close means I am ready to take in only secondary or renewable sources. And capture is about that industry out there pulling in and regenerating into new areas. And if you're in recycling, you're part of the capture industry. So that should feel pretty high to you since you're in that space. We'll give a couple minutes for this. I know this is a multi-part question, just one question for you after this, a few more food for thought pieces, and you'll be on your way to the next part of this conference. And again, how this works is you can slide across the screen and say, how ready are we to come and tackle this? Most organizations I interview or I talk to aren't very far in capture, but again, you are such a unique group that your ability to capture is quite cool. Okay, one final question for everybody. Now, think about one word, just one single word that you learned, that struck you, that was a new idea for you, some single word. I think you have 3 chances, so you can come up with 3 one-word options, depending on some concept or some new idea that stuck with you today, whether it was around something in the circular economy and that concept, whether it was something around the definition of a circular supply chain, the different characteristics, or whether it was something in this last section around getting started, the different steps that we can take, the shifts that we can make. Fugitive value, thank you for that one. I really like that one too. Regenerative is really important, and a good preview into our last few slides here. Kaizen is super important. Collaboration is super important. There's a lot of work happening around industry right now, collaborating among competitors to set industry standards. We don't have accepted ways to measure this through our value chains and operations right now, which is a barrier kind of stunting our ability to get going. Flexibility is super important. I think what's coming out in the land of material science is going to be pretty mind-blowing in the next couple of years. And we're going to need to be able to use those new types of bio-based materials in our operations. Circularity made the cut, which is great. Investment, we didn't talk about it at all today, but this is one area that the large financial institutions love to invest in. If you think about it, today's world is rather risky to invest in operations because where will our inputs come from? Is this sustainable? Can you continue to run your business? In the future, if you're using a circular operation, you have much higher material security. And this is actually seen as a less risky investment for a lot of these large investors like BlackRock, JP Morgan, etc. This is a lovely word cloud. We'll see if anybody has a final question, word to add, but thank you for participating there. I'd like to share a few more thoughts with you now, and we'll call it a day. So sustainability, we talk a lot about sustainability these days, but I'd like to kind of throw down that sustainability is not enough. And of course, when we think about this world, we have pushed our source of raw materials past where we're able to sustain. So if we were just to continue to cruise today like we're doing, we've pushed it a little too far. So 100 billion tons, you know this, sustainability is not enough. Regenerative supply chains are needed. If we think about these two concepts we've explored together today, value and waste, and we want to increase value and decrease waste, in reality, what this comes to is not waste to value, but value to value. And it's not up or down, it's a circle, it's an exchange. It's saying, look, there's something that has value to someone that's in my value chain. It just doesn't have value to me anymore. I'm going to find someone to exchange that with. I didn't come up with this idea, of course. The idea of regenerative supply chains are all around us, and many of the leaders are starting to explore. Patagonia, of course, very interesting what's going on. Since I took this screenshot, they have launched putting repaired, used clothing on the same rack right next to the exact same item that's brand new to give consumers a full and easy, accessible choice. Now, our challenge in operations is to apply the same types of concepts as we see in the consumer world, but inside of our operations. And if we do that right, then we can build a regenerative design that, again, puts back resources into the biosphere so we have those to pull on for many years to come. And of course, regeneration is the third principle of the circular economy, which makes this a nice model for us to choose. For the time today, we've covered what is a circular economy, we've covered what is a circular supply chain, and a few ideas for getting started. Thanks for joining me. If this is at all interesting to you, I run a global nonprofit called the Circular Supply Chain Network. We have discussions every Thursday That timing changes as we've got folks around the world. And so that timing changes a little bit each week as we become more available and accessible. If you point your phone camera at the screen, you'll be taken to our homepage, which is circularsupplychain.network. You can also, of course, follow us on LinkedIn. So your feed has nice little good news stories about the work already happening in circular supply chains today. So again, thank you very much. And Karen, over to you.
Deborah, thank you so much. What a really informative, interesting presentation. It is so exciting to see all the different things that are happening. It makes me feel like the work that we're doing, we're not alone in that work. And, you know, you identified us right. We really are in that capture portion of the circularity, but we all have operations ourselves that we can follow that same circular, model to make sure our operations are being efficient. But you did mention that packaging is often that thing, that source of material that doesn't get counted, that is invisible. Do you have any predictions for the future about how maybe we'll be more, present to what packaging is and does for us?
Absolutely. We're already starting to see business models around reusable pallets. A company called CHEP, for example, has been really pioneering in this space and trying to figure out how do we actually add value with our pallets. So imagine it's a pallet that is treated like an asset with a serial number. And in that pallet is a way to track globally where anything on that pallet could be tracked. And now we have a better, more accurate source of information through our value chains rather than a barcode that was scanned or not scanned as it went through whatever process it was. So we're already seeing that with pallets. I'm starting to see reusable, I'll call it packaging for the industrial space. So we have these large pieces of equipment and assets going through the world. How can we have these be reusable in some manner? Now, this is going to require that we cooperate across our value chains, which means our logistics providers or someone similar can help act as a broker between us. And it's going to require quite a sophisticated level of asset management applied in a way we haven't done before. So this is already starting to happen in the industrial side, which I personally find to be more interesting as the resource use and waste produced by industry is far, far higher than anything that's produced in municipalities. And so I think our focus there can really be transformative.
Yeah, treating waste as assets, I think, is the next step for us. And then I would ask too that the regionalism really spoke to me, because I do think that the work that we do, especially trying to provide services to residents, to small businesses, and smaller scale kind of operations, how do we, and what is the future of designing for kind of a smaller economy of scale? We saw a little bit of that kind of nano work, but what can you predict for us in this industry?
Yeah, look, I think we're going to actually be able to leave items as themselves instead of breaking them down. So if you think about the butterfly diagram and you want to have items smaller. So if I think about something like a glass bottle, there are many economies in the world that actually have a very hefty deposit. So I'll take a beer bottle in Germany. Maybe the beer itself costs €1.50. The deposit is €4. So you have to pay that when you buy it, but man, are you motivated to bring that bottle back? And it's not crushed. It's actually just washed and used again. And the value that adds back into the economy then is pretty tremendous, because the same amount of money, of course, can be charged. And so the company makes a whole lot more money on that bottle of beer than they did if they had to actually produce the bottle itself. So Anheuser-Busch is actually starting to pilot this in the Bay Area now, which I'm really excited about. It's been something I've wished could be in more American markets, because there's a lot of money to be made for us. So I predict that you all will help to take these smaller circles, leave items as themselves for as long as possible, and help us manage that process in the best way so that we don't have to crush and start over again. We can actually allow those items to add more value.
Excellent. Excellent presentation. Thank you so much, Deborah. We appreciate you taking time to be with us today. I'll thank all of our attendees for being with us. Thank our sponsors as well for supporting what it is we do. And we will go on to our next presentation.